Briar had not been touched by another living soul in 12 years. She stood in the corner of her family's great hall, pressed against the cold stone wall, watching the celebration unfold before her like a dream she was not allowed to enter. Her younger sister Rosalind twirled across the dance floor in a gown of cream silk, laughing as suitor after suitor vied for her attention. Their parents beamed from their seats at the high table, proud and resplendent in their finest clothes. The hall overflowed with music and warmth and joy, and Briar stood alone in the shadows, wearing gloves that reached past her elbows and a gown of funeral black. It had been this way since she was 6 years old. That was when the curse had first manifested, on the morning of her sister's birth. Briar had reached out to touch the newborn's cheek, wanting only to welcome her into the world, and Rosalind had screamed as if she were being burned alive. The healers had found an angry red welt where Briar's fingers had grazed the baby's skin, blistered and raw. After that, everything changed. Her parents had called in every healer, every mystic, every witch they could find. None of them could explain what had happened or how to undo it. They only confirmed what was already obvious. Briar's touch was poison. Her skin carried a curse that burned anyone foolish enough to make contact with it. She was dangerous, defective, an abomination that should never have been born. Her mother had stopped embracing her. Her father had stopped looking at her entirely. The servants learned to leave her meals outside her door and to never, ever reach for her hand. Briar grew up in a house full of people and yet utterly alone, starving for a kindness that no one dared to give her. Now she was 18, and nothing had changed. She was still the family's shameful secret, trotted out for formal occasions only because her absence would raise too many questions. She was still the cursed daughter, the monster in gloves, the girl no one would ever love. The music swelled, and Briar pressed herself further into the shadows. Perhaps if she stayed quiet enough, still enough, she could disappear entirely. "You must be Lady Briar." The voice came from directly beside her, deep and smooth as velvet. Briar startled so violently that she nearly tripped over her own feet. She had not heard anyone approach, had not sensed anyone standing close enough to speak to her. She turned, and her breath caught in her throat. The man beside her was tall and powerfully built, with shoulders that strained against the fine black fabric of his coat. His hair was dark as a raven's wing, swept back from a face that was almost too handsome, all sharp cheekbones, and a strong jaw and lips that curved in a faint, knowing smile. But it was his eyes that held her frozen in place. They were silver, pale and luminous as moonlight on snow, and they watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle beneath her gloves. "I am," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you are?" "Darius Valamont." He inclined his head in a gesture that was somehow both polite and predatory. "Alpha King of the Northern Realm. I arrived this evening at your father's invitation." Briar's stomach dropped. The Alpha King. She had heard the servants whispering about his impending visit for weeks, though no one had bothered to tell her directly. He was said to be the most powerful wolf in existence, a conqueror who had united the warring packs of the North through sheer force of will. He was also said to be cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy. He did not look cold now. He looked curious, his silver eyes tracing across her face as if searching for something hidden beneath the surface. "You should not stand so close to me," Briar said, the warning automatic after so many years. "I am not safe to be near." "So I have heard." Darius took a step closer instead of backing away, and Briar's heart hammered against her ribs. "They say you carry a curse. They say your touch brings agony to anyone foolish enough to brush against your skin." "It is not foolishness. It is truth." She held up her gloved hands, a barrier between them. "Please, Your Majesty, step away. I do not wish to hurt you." The Alpha King smiled, and the expression transformed his face from handsome to devastating. "You will not hurt me," he said with absolute certainty. I knew that the moment I walked into this hall and caught your scent. Before Briar could ask what he meant, he reached out and caught her wrist. She gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip was like iron. His fingers found the edge of her glove and tugged, slowly, deliberately, peeling the silk away from her skin inch by inch. Briar watched in horror, waiting for the inevitable scream, waiting for him to crumple to his knees in agony. The glove fell to the floor. Darius wrapped his bare hand around hers. Nothing happened. No screaming, no blistering, no pain. His skin pressed against hers, warm and solid and impossibly real, and Briar felt nothing but the steady thrum of his pulse against her palm. How? She breathed, staring at their joined hands. How is this possible? Darius lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his silver eyes never leaving hers. Because you are not cursed, little wolf, he murmured against her skin. You are my mate, and the curse was never meant to harm me. The world tilted beneath Briar's feet, and everything she had believed about herself shattered like glass. The next hour passed in a blur of chaos and confusion. Briar's father had turned pale as death when the Alpha King announced his intention to take her back to his kingdom. Her mother had actually fainted, crumpling into her chair like a marionette with its strings cut. Rosalind had watched from across the hall with wide, frightened eyes, and for the first time in years, Briar had seen something other than pity in her sister's gaze. She had seen envy. Now, Briar sat in a carriage bound for the northern realm, her bare hands folded in her lap, still marveling at the sensation of air against her skin. Darius sat across from her, his silver eyes watching her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. You are staring at your hands, he observed. Briar curled her fingers into her palms, suddenly self-conscious. I have worn gloves every day for 12 years. I had forgotten what my own skin looked like. Something flickered across his face, too quick to name. Your family should never have made you hide. They should have searched for answers instead of treating you like a monster. They tried. The defense rose automatically, a habit born of years spent making excuses for the people who were supposed to love her. They brought in healers, mystics, anyone who might be able to help. No one could explain what was wrong with me. Because nothing is wrong with you. Darius leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and the intensity of his gaze pinned her in place. What you carry is not a curse, Briar. It is a gift. A rare and powerful gift that marks you as something extraordinary. Briar shook her head, unable to accept what he was saying. She had spent 12 years believing she was broken, dangerous, unlovable. She could not simply discard that belief because a stranger told her otherwise. If it is a gift, then why does it burn everyone who touches me? She demanded. Why did I hurt my sister when she was only a baby? Why have I spent my entire life alone? Darius was quiet for a long moment. The carriage rattled on through the darkness, and Briar could hear the distant howl of wolves in the forest beyond. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had expected. What you carry is called the Moonfire, he said. It is an ancient power, passed down through certain bloodlines, that manifests only in wolves destined for great purpose. Your touch burns because your fire recognizes that those around you are not meant to be your pack. They are not your true family. Briar's throat tightened. And you? Why does it not burn you? Because I am your mate. He said it simply, as if stating an obvious fact. The Moonfire recognizes me as yours, just as my wolf recognized you as mine the moment I entered that hall. We were made for each other, Briar, two halves of the same soul. It was too much. It was all too much. Briar pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to stop the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. She had dreamed of being touched for so long, had ached for even the simplest brush of fingers against her arm. And now a king was telling her she was destined to be his mate, that her curse was actually a gift, that everything she had suffered had been for a purpose. She did not know whether to laugh or scream. "I do not know you," she said, her voice cracking. "You appear at my father's hall, touch me without permission, and now you are taking me to a kingdom I have never seen. How am I supposed to trust anything you say?" Darius reached across the space between them and took her hand. The warmth of his skin against hers still felt miraculous, and Briar could not bring herself to pull away. "You are right," he said quietly. "I have given you no reason to trust me. I have only given you claims and expectations and a carriage ride into the unknown." His thumb traced slow circles against her palm, and the sensation made her shiver. "So I will make you a promise. When we reach my kingdom, you will have your own chambers. You will be free to explore, to ask questions, to learn everything you wish to know about the Moonfire and what it means. I will not touch you again unless you ask me to. And if, after 1 month, you still wish to leave, I will escort you home myself." Briar searched his face for deception, for the cruelty she had learned to expect from everyone around her. She found only patience and a vulnerability that seemed at odds with everything she had heard about the fearsome Alpha King. "1 month?" she repeated. 1 month. He released her hand and sat back, and Briar immediately missed his warmth. "That is all I ask. A chance to prove that you were never the monster, Briar." They were. The carriage rolled on through the night, carrying her toward a future she could not begin to imagine. Briar looked down at her bare hands, still tingling from his touch, and allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in 12 years. Hope. The Northern Kingdom was nothing like Briar had imagined. She had expected cold and darkness, a fortress of ice to match the fearsome reputation of its king. Instead, she found a palace of pale stone nestled in a valley surrounded by snow-capped mountains, its towers reaching toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Gardens sprawled across the grounds, filled with winter roses and evergreen hedges, and the air smelled of pine and wood smoke and something sweet she could not name. Her chambers were in the eastern tower, a suite of rooms with tall windows that overlooked the mountains. The bed was draped in furs so soft she had gasped when she first touched them. A fire crackled constantly in the stone hearth, keeping the chill at bay, and fresh flowers appeared on her bedside table every morning without her ever seeing who placed them there. True to his word, Darius did not touch her. He joined her for meals in the great hall, sitting close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, but he kept his hands carefully to himself. He answered her endless questions about the Moonfire with patience and detail, explaining how the ancient power worked and why it had chosen her. He showed her the palace library, a vast room filled with books about wolf history and magic and legends, and left her there for hours to read and explore. But he never touched her, and Briar found herself missing it more than she had any right to. On the 7th night, she could not sleep. The fire had burned low in her hearth, and the shadows in her chambers seemed to press against her skin like memories she could not escape. She pulled a robe over her nightgown and slipped out into the corridor, not sure where she was going, only knowing that she could not stay still any longer. She found Darius in the library. He sat in a chair by the window, bathed in moonlight, a book open in his lap that he was not reading. His silver eyes stared out at the darkness beyond the glass, and there was something in his expression that made Briar's heart clench. He looked lonely. He looked exactly the way she had felt for 12 years. "You should be sleeping," he said without turning around. Briar stepped further into the room. "So should you." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I do not sleep well. I never have." She crossed to the window and stood beside his chair, close enough to touch if she dared. The moonlight turned his dark hair silver at the edges, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he held himself apart. "Why not?" she asked. Darius was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than she had ever heard it. When I was young, my father was challenged by a rival alpha. He lost. The rival killed him and took our pack, and my mother and I were cast out into the wilderness to die. His jaw tightened. We survived, but barely. For years we had nothing. No home, no pack, no safety. I learned to sleep with one eye open, always waiting for the next attack. Even now, even with all of this, I cannot seem to unlearn it. Briar's chest ached. She had spent so long wrapped up in her own suffering that she had not considered what wounds the Alpha King might carry. She had assumed his power meant he had never known pain. She had been wrong. "I understand," she said softly. "After the curse manifested, I used to lie awake every night terrified that I would accidentally touch someone in my sleep. I would wrap myself in blankets until I could barely move, just to make sure I could not hurt anyone. Even now, I still wake up in a panic sometimes, certain that I have done something terrible." Darius looked up at her, and the rawness in his silver eyes stole her breath. "We are quite the pair, are we not? Two broken creatures, afraid of the dark. Perhaps we are not as broken as we think." The words left her mouth before she could stop them, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks. Darius set his book aside and rose from his chair, standing so close that she could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin. He did not touch her. He waited, his hands at his sides, his eyes asking a question his lips did not speak. Briar reached out and took his hand. The touch sent warmth flooding through her veins, chasing away the cold that had settled in her bones. Darius inhaled sharply, his fingers curling around hers, and the look on his face was one of barely restrained hunger. "Briar," he said, her name a ragged whisper. "You said you would not touch me unless I asked." She stepped closer until their chests nearly touched. "I am asking." He raised his free hand, slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she did not, he cupped her cheek, his palm warm and rough against her skin. Briar closed her eyes and leaned into the touch, and for the first time in 12 years, she felt truly seen. "You are not broken," he murmured. "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever touched." They stood together in the moonlit library, skin against skin, and Briar felt the walls around her heart begin to crumble. After that night, everything changed. Darius no longer kept his distance. He reached for her hand when they walked through the palace gardens, his fingers intertwining with hers as naturally as breathing. He brushed stray hair from her face at breakfast, his touch lingering against her cheek. He sat beside her in the library while she read, close enough that their shoulders pressed together, and the warmth of his body became the most familiar sensation in the world. Briar drank it in like water after a drought. 12 years of isolation had left her desperate for contact, and Darius seemed to understand that hunger without her ever having to explain it. He touched her constantly, casually, as if reminding her that she was real, that she was safe, that she would never have to be alone again. 2 weeks into her stay, he took her to meet his mother. Lady Seraphine Vallemont lived in a cottage at the edge of the palace grounds, surrounded by wildflowers and herb gardens. She was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, and when she opened her door and saw Briar standing beside her son, her face broke into a smile so warm it made Briar's chest ache. "So this is her," Seraphine said, reaching out to clasp Briar's hands in both of her own. "The one who carries the moonfire. I have waited a long time to meet you, child." Briar blinked in surprise. "You know about the moonfire?" "I know many things." Seraphine drew her inside the cottage, leaving Darius to follow behind them. The interior was cozy and cluttered, filled with dried herbs and old books and the lingering scent of lavender. "I was a healer before I was a queen, and a scholar before I was a healer. When Darius first told me about you, I recognized the signs immediately." "You knew what I was?" Briar sank into a chair by the fire, her mind spinning. "But my family consulted dozens of healers. None of them could explain my curse, because they were looking for a curse. Seraphine settled across from her, her weathered hands folded in her lap. The moonfire is rare, child, so rare that most healers have never heard of it, let alone seen it manifest. Your family's so-called experts were searching for something dark and twisted when the truth was bright and beautiful all along. Darius moved to stand behind Briar's chair, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. The weight of it grounded her, steadied her, gave her the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind since the night he first touched her. If the moonfire is a gift, why does it burn everyone except Darius? Why could I not touch my own family without hurting them? Seraphine exchanged a glance with her son, and something unspoken passed between them. When she turned back to Briar, her expression was gentle but serious. The moonfire is not simply a power, she said carefully. It is a protection. It shields its bearer from those who would do her harm, marking them with pain when they try to touch what they have no right to claim. She leaned forward, her eyes searching Briar's face. Tell me, child, in all the years you wore those gloves, in all the times you accidentally brushed against someone, did you ever burn anyone who truly loved you? Briar opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. She thought of her mother, who had recoiled from her touch the moment the curse appeared. She thought of her father, who had looked at her with disgust ever since. She thought of her sister, who had grown up fearing her, and the servants, who had been taught to see her as a monster. She thought of every person who had ever touched her and been burned, and she realized, with a cold shock that stole her breath, that not a single one of them had truly loved her. No, she whispered. There was never anyone who loved me enough to touch. Darius's grip tightened on her shoulder. When she looked up at him, his silver eyes were blazing with barely contained fury. Your family did not deserve you, he said, his voice rough. They had a treasure in their midst, and they treated you like a curse. They will answer for that someday. Seraphine rose from her chair and crossed to Briar, kneeling before her with surprising grace for a woman her age. She took Briar's bare hands in her own, and Briar tensed, waiting for the burn, waiting for the scream. It never came. Seraphine's hands were warm and soft, and they held Briar's without a hint of pain. The moonfire knows a loving heart when it finds one, Seraphine said gently. I loved you before I ever met you, child, because my son loves you, and the fire inside you recognizes that love for what it is. Tears spilled down Briar's cheeks. She had not cried in years, had trained herself to swallow her grief and lock it away where no one could see. But here, in this cottage, surrounded by people who touched her without flinching, she could not hold it back any longer. Darius pulled her to her feet and into his arms, holding her against his chest while she sobbed. His mother's hand rested on her back, a second point of warmth and comfort, and Briar wept for everything she had lost and everything she had finally found. When the tears subsided, she pulled back and looked up at Darius with swollen eyes. I think I am starting to understand, she said softly. Why you brought me here. Why you refused to let me believe I was broken. Darius cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the lingering tears. You were never broken, Briar. You were just waiting for people worthy of your fire. She leaned into his touch, and for the first time in her life, she believed him. 3 weeks into her stay, the palace held its annual winter ball. Briar had tried to refuse. The thought of standing in a crowded room, surrounded by strangers who might accidentally brush against her skin, made her chest tight with panic. But Darius had taken her hands in his and promised that she would be safe, that he would stay by her side every moment, that no one would touch her without permission. And so she found herself descending the grand staircase in a gown of deep crimson silk, her dark hair swept up and adorned with tiny crystals that caught the candlelight. The gown left her arms bare, a deliberate choice that still made her heart race with fear. For 12 years, she had hidden every inch of her skin. Tonight, She was finally letting the world see what she had been taught to conceal. Darius waited for her at the bottom of the stairs. He wore a coat of midnight black trimmed with silver, and his dark hair was swept back from his face, emphasizing the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the impossible paleness of his eyes. When he saw her, he went utterly still, and the look on his face made Briar's breath catch in her throat. "You are stunning," he said, his voice rough. He took her hand and pressed a kiss to her bare knuckles, lingering there longer than was proper. "Every man in this room is going to hate me for having you on my arm." Heat crept up Briar's neck. "I doubt anyone will notice me when their king is standing right there." "They will notice you." His silver eyes burned into hers. "They will notice you because you shine brighter than anyone I have ever seen. And they will know, by the end of this night, exactly who you are to me." He led her into the ballroom, and the crowd parted before them like water before a ship. Briar could feel hundreds of eyes fixed on her bare arms, could hear the whispers rippling through the assembled nobles. She forced herself to stand tall, to keep her chin lifted, to not shrink back into the shadows the way she had done her entire life. Darius swept her onto the dance floor, and the orchestra began to play. They danced for hours. Briar lost track of time, lost track of everything except the warmth of his hand at her waist and the steadiness of his gaze on her face. He guided her through waltzes and reels, never letting her stumble, never letting her forget that she was exactly where she belonged. When the music finally slowed to something soft and intimate, Darius pulled her closer until their bodies pressed together from chest to hip. Briar could feel his heartbeat against hers, fast and unsteady, and she realized with a jolt that he was just as affected by their closeness as she was. "The month is almost over," he said quietly. "In a few days, you will have to decide whether to stay or go." Briar's heart stuttered. She had been trying not to think about it, trying to pretend that time was not passing, that this dream did not have to end. "I know. I will keep my promise." His voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the fear he was trying to hide. "If you wish to return to your family, I will take you myself. I will not force you to stay." "Darius." She stopped dancing, her hands gripping his shoulders, and looked up at him with everything she felt written plainly on her face. "I do not want to go back." Something flickered in his silver eyes. Hope, barely daring to breathe. "Briar." "I spent 12 years believing I was a monster," she said, her voice trembling. "I spent 12 years alone, untouched, convinced that no one would ever love me because of what I was. And then you walked into my father's hall and took my hand, and everything changed." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to say the words she had been holding back for weeks. "I love you, Darius. I love you, and I do not want to leave. I want to stay here, with you, for as long as you will have me." Darius made a sound that was almost a groan, his hands tightening at her waist. "For as long as I will have you? Briar, I will have you forever. I will have you until the stars burn out and the moon falls from the sky. I love you more than I have ever loved anything in my life." She kissed him. She rose onto her toes and pressed her lips to his, and the world around them disappeared. He kissed her back with a desperate hunger, his arms wrapping around her, lifting her until her feet left the ground. She tasted wine and heat, and something wild that was uniquely him, and her wolf surged inside her chest, howling with joy she had never known. When they finally broke apart, the entire ballroom had gone silent. Hundreds of nobles stared at them with wide eyes and open mouths, and Briar realized that the Alpha King had just kissed her senseless in front of his entire court. She should have been embarrassed. Instead, she laughed. Darius grinned down at her, his silver eyes bright with mischief and adoration. "Well, I suppose the kingdom knows exactly who you are to me now." "I suppose they do." Briar pulled him down for another kiss, and the crowd erupted into cheers around them. She had spent her whole life in the shadows. Now she was finally standing in the light. Her family arrived 3 days later. Briar was in the library when the servants came to fetch her, their faces pale with unease. She followed them to the entrance hall, her stomach twisting with a dread she could not name, and found her parents standing in the center of the marble floor with Rosalind between them. They looked different than she remembered, smaller somehow. Her father's shoulders were stooped, and her mother's face was drawn and tired. Rosalind stood with her hands clasped before her, her golden hair immaculate, her expression carefully neutral. They were dressed in their finest clothes, silks and velvets that Briar knew had been purchased with money that should have been spent on healers and mystics to cure their cursed daughter. Briar. Her mother stepped forward, arms outstretched as if to embrace her. My darling girl, we have missed you so terribly. Briar stepped back before she could stop herself. The old fear surged through her veins, the instinct to protect others from her touch. Then she remembered that she was not wearing gloves, that her skin was bare, and that the moonfire would burn anyone who tried to touch her without love. Her mother stopped short, her arms falling to her sides. Something flickered in her eyes. Not hurt, Briar realized. Calculation. What are you doing here? Briar asked, her voice steadier than she felt. We came to see you, of course. Her father stepped forward, his smile stretched too wide across his face. When we heard that you were to become queen of the Northern Realm, we knew we had to come and congratulate you in person. Our daughter, a queen. We always knew you were destined for greatness. The lie was so blatant that Briar almost laughed. They had called her a monster, a curse, a stain on the family name. They had locked her away and treated her like a burden to be endured. And now that she was about to marry a king, they wanted to rewrite history. You sold me, she said quietly. You looked at me like I was something to be ashamed of. You spent 12 years making me believe I was broken beyond repair. We were trying to protect you, her mother said quickly. We did not understand your gift. We made mistakes, yes, but we always loved you. Surely you can find it in your heart to forgive us. Footsteps echoed behind Briar, and then Darius was there, his hand coming to rest at the small of her back. The warmth of his touch steadied her, gave her strength she had not known she possessed. Lord and Lady Thornwood, he said, his voice cold as winter steel, I do not recall inviting you to my kingdom. Her father paled but held his ground. Your Majesty, we simply wish to see our daughter and offer our blessings on the upcoming union. Surely you cannot fault parents for wanting to share in their child's happiness. I can fault parents who treated their child like a curse for 18 years and have now come crawling back because they smell an opportunity. Darius's silver eyes swept over them with barely concealed contempt. You did not come here for Briar. You came here for what she can give you. Rosalind stepped forward then, and for the first time, Briar saw something other than neutrality in her sister's expression. She saw desperation. Sister, Rosalind said, her voice trembling, please, you do not understand what it has been like since you left. Father lost our fortune in bad investments. We have nothing. We were going to lose the estate, our standing, everything. When we heard about your engagement, we thought perhaps you could help us. Briar stared at her sister, the girl she had accidentally burned as a baby, the girl who had grown up perfect and beloved while Briar rotted in the shadows. She waited to feel satisfaction at their downfall. She waited to feel vindication. Instead, she only felt tired. You want money? She said flatly. We want to be a family again. Her mother reached out, and this time she made contact, her fingers wrapping around Briar's bare wrist. The scream that tore from her mother's throat echoed through the hall. Briar jerked back as her mother crumpled to her knees, clutching her hand to her chest. Angry red welts bloomed across her palm where she had touched Briar's skin, blistering and raw. Her father rushed to his wife's side, his face twisted with horror. Monster, he spat, the word dripping with venom. You are still a monster, no matter how many crowns they put on your head. The words hit Briar like a blow. She stumbled backward, the old shame flooding through her, drowning out everything Darius had taught her to believe. She had burned her mother. She had hurt someone again. The Moonfire had judged her family and found them wanting, but all Briar could feel was the familiar weight of guilt crushing her chest. She turned and fled before anyone could stop her. Behind her, she heard Darius's voice raised in fury, heard guards moving to escort her family from the hall. But the sounds faded as she ran, replaced by the thundering of her own heartbeat and the echo of her father's voice in her ears. Monster, monster, monster. Perhaps they had been right about her all along. Briar locked herself in her chambers and refused to come out. She pulled the gloves back on, the silk sliding over her skin like a shroud. She drew the curtains against the winter light. She curled up in the center of her bed and pressed her face into the furs, trying to disappear the way she had learned to disappear as a child. The knock came within the hour. Briar. Darius's voice was rough with concern. Please, let me in. She did not answer. She could not bear to see him, could not bear to watch his silver eyes fill with the same fear and disgust she had seen in her father's face. Sooner or later, he would realize the truth. Sooner or later, he would understand that the Moonfire was not a gift, but a poison, and that she would only bring him pain. Your family has been escorted from the kingdom, Darius continued through the door. They will not be permitted to return. You are safe. Safe. The word tasted bitter on her tongue. She had never been safe. She had never been anything but a danger to everyone around her. The hours passed in silence. Darius came and went, his footsteps pacing outside her door, his voice growing more desperate with each visit. Servants left trays of food that Briar did not touch. The fire in her hearth burned low and cold. On the second day, a different voice spoke through the door. Child. Seraphine's tone was gentle but firm. I know what you are feeling. I know the shame they put inside you, the voices that tell you that you are worthless and dangerous and unlovable. But those voices are lies. They have always been lies. Briar pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block out the words. The Moonfire burned your mother because she does not love you, Seraphine continued. It has always burned those who meant you harm, who saw you as a burden rather than a blessing. That is not your fault, Briar. You did not choose to be born with this gift, and you are not responsible for the cruelty of those who should have protected you. I hurt her, Briar whispered, her voice cracking. I hurt my own mother. Your mother hurt herself the moment she decided that her daughter was a monster instead of a miracle. Seraphine's voice softened. The Moonfire only revealed what was already true. It did not create the wound. It simply refused to let you be harmed by someone who did not deserve your trust. Briar said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. My son loves you, Seraphine said finally. He has barely slept since you locked yourself away. He paces the halls like a caged wolf, terrified that he has lost you before he ever truly had you. A pause. Do not let them win, child. Do not let the people who tried to break you succeed in driving you away from the people who want to help you heal. The footsteps retreated, and Briar was alone again. She stayed in her chambers for one more night, wrestling with demons she had carried for 12 years. She thought of her father's face, twisted with disgust. She thought of her mother's scream, the welts blooming across her palm. She thought of every moment she had spent alone, untouched, convinced that she was poison. And then she thought of Darius. She thought of his hand wrapped around hers in the carriage, warm and unafraid. She thought of his silver eyes softening when he looked at her, the way he touched her like she was something precious. She thought of his voice in the library, rough with old grief, admitting that he had never learned to sleep peacefully. She thought of his mother, kneeling before her, holding her hands without flinching. She thought of the moonfire, burning only those who meant her harm, protecting her from the very people who should have loved her. And she realized, with a clarity that stole her breath, that her family had been wrong. They had always been wrong. The moonfire was not a curse. It was a gift that had been trying to show her the truth for 12 years, and she had been too afraid to see it. The people who hurt her were not worthy of her fire. But Darius was. Briar rose from her bed, stripped off her gloves, and opened the door. Darius was there, slumped against the wall across from her chambers, his silver eyes ringed with shadows. He looked like he had not slept in days, his dark hair disheveled, his fine clothes rumpled. When he saw her, he scrambled to his feet, his expression flooding with desperate hope. "Briar," he breathed. She crossed the corridor and threw herself into his arms. He caught her without hesitation, crushing her against his chest, his face buried in her hair. She could feel him shaking, could hear the ragged edge of his breath, and she held him just as tightly. "I am sorry," she whispered against his shoulder. "I should not have run. I should not have hidden from you." "You have nothing to apologize for." His voice was rough, barely controlled. "They hurt you. They have been hurting you your entire life. You are allowed to grieve that." Briar pulled back enough to look at his face, at the exhaustion and the relief and the love written in every line. "I do not want to grieve anymore," she said. "I want to live. With you." Darius kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose. "Then live with me," he murmured against her skin. "Stay with me. Be my queen, my mate, my everything. I will spend the rest of my life proving that you were never the monster they said you were." Briar rose onto her toes and kissed him properly, and the darkness inside her finally began to fade. The attack came on the night of the new moon. Briar woke to the sound of screaming. She bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding, and saw flames dancing beyond her window. The palace was under siege. Dark shapes moved through the courtyard below, and she could hear the clash of steel against steel, the roar of wolves locked in combat. Her door burst open, and Darius stood in the threshold, blood streaming from a gash across his temple. His silver eyes were wild with fury and fear. "We have to go," he said, grabbing her hand and pulling her from the bed. "Now." "What is happening?" Briar stumbled after him, her bare feet sliding on the cold stone floor. "Who is attacking us?" "Lord Varen." Darius's jaw tightened as he led her through the corridors. Guards ran past them, swords drawn, their faces grim. "He is the son of the Alpha who killed my father. He has spent years gathering an army to take back what he believes is rightfully his." Briar's blood ran cold. "How did he get past the defenses?" Darius did not answer, but the look in his eyes told her everything. Someone had betrayed them. Someone had opened the gates from the inside. They made it to the great hall before the attackers found them. A dozen men in black armor flooded through the doors, their weapons raised. At their head stood a wolf with pale hair and cruel blue eyes, his smile sharp as a blade. Behind him, flanked by 2 guards, stood Briar's father. "Lord Thornwood," Darius snarled. "I should have known." Briar's father stepped forward, his expression twisted with satisfaction. "You should have killed us when you had the chance, Your Majesty. Instead, you merely escorted us to the border, where Lord Varen's men were waiting." He turned his cold gaze to Briar. "This is your fault, monster. If you had simply given us what we asked for, none of this would have been necessary." Lord Varen laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the hall. "Enough talk. Kill the king and bring me the girl. I have heard interesting rumors about her particular gift, and I wish to see it for myself." The soldiers advanced. Darius shifted in an instant, his massive silver wolf surging forward to meet them. He was a blur of fangs and fury, tearing through the first line of attackers like paper. But there were too many of them, and more kept pouring through the doors. Briar watched in horror as a soldier's blade caught Darius across the flank. He stumbled, blood staining his silver fur, and 3 more attackers closed in around him. Something inside her snapped. The moonfire had always been a shield, a protection against those who wished her harm. But as Briar watched the man she loved being overwhelmed by enemies, she felt the fire surge through her veins with a new and terrible purpose. It was not just a defense, it was a weapon. She stepped forward and raised her bare hands. Light exploded from her palms, brilliant and blinding, the color of molten silver. It swept across the hall in a wave, and every enemy it touched screamed as their skin blistered and burned. The soldiers fell back, clawing at their faces, their armor smoking. Lord Varen stumbled, his cruel smile replaced by shock and pain. Briar walked through the chaos like a goddess of vengeance, her hands blazing with fire that burned only those who meant her harm. She passed the loyal guards without touching them. She passed Darius, who had shifted back to human form, and stared at her with awe and something like fear. She did not stop until she stood before her father. "You sold me as a child," she said, her voice ringing through the hall. "You called me a monster and a curse. You tried to use me, and when that failed, you tried to have me killed." The moonfire danced across her fingers, hungry and waiting. "Give me one reason I should not burn you where you stand." Her father fell to his knees, his face ashen with terror. "Please," he gasped. "Please, I am your father. I raised you. You never raised me." Briar's voice was cold as the mountains beyond the palace walls. "You locked me away and pretended I did not exist. You are not my father. You are nothing to me." She could feel the fire begging to be released, begging to judge him the way it had judged her mother. But as she looked down at the pathetic, trembling man before her, she realized she did not want his death. She wanted him to live. She wanted him to spend the rest of his miserable life knowing that the daughter he had called a monster had become a queen. She lowered her hands, and the moonfire faded to embers. "Take him to the dungeons," she said to the guards who had gathered behind her. "Take Lord Varen as well. They will face the king's justice at dawn." The guards obeyed without question. As her father was dragged away, Briar turned to find Darius watching her with an expression she could not read. "Briar," he said softly. "That was... I know." She looked down at her hands, still faintly glowing. "I did not know I could do that." Darius crossed the hall and took her face in his hands, his silver eyes blazing with something fierce and proud. "You are magnificent," he said. "You are the most powerful wolf I have ever seen, and you are mine." He kissed her, and the last of the moonfire's light faded into warmth that had nothing to do with magic. The trial was held at noon the following day. The great hall had been restored to order, the blood scrubbed from the stones and the broken furniture replaced. Nobles from across the northern realm filled the gallery, their faces a mixture of curiosity and awe. Word had spread quickly about what had happened during the attack, about the king's future bride who had wielded silver fire and single-handedly turned the tide of battle. Briar stood beside Darius on the dais, dressed in a gown of deep violet that left her arms bare. She no longer felt the need to hide. The moonfire hummed quietly beneath her skin, a warm presence that no longer frightened her. It was part of her, as natural as breathing, and she had finally learned to embrace it. Lord Varen was brought forward first, his wrists bound in iron chains. The arrogance had been beaten out of him overnight, and he looked smaller than he had during the attack, diminished by defeat and the knowledge of what awaited him. "Lord Varen," Darius said, his voice echoing through the hall, "you are charged with treason, attempted regicide, and conspiracy to overthrow the crown. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Your own soldiers have confessed to your plans in exchange for mercy. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Varen lifted his head, a spark of defiance still burning in his pale eyes. My father was the rightful ruler of this realm. You and your mother should have died in the wilderness where we left you. Everything I did was to reclaim what was stolen from my family. Your father was a tyrant who murdered innocents and ruled through terror. Darius's voice was cold as iron. He died because he was challenged by wolves who had suffered under his cruelty. There was no theft, there was justice. He turned to his guards. The sentence is death. It will be carried out at sunset. Varen did not protest as he was dragged away. He seemed to have expected nothing less. Then it was her father's turn. Lord Thornwood shuffled forward in chains, his fine clothes torn and dirty, his face haggard with sleeplessness. He looked nothing like the imposing figure who had loomed over Briar's childhood, issuing pronouncements about her monstrousness. He looked old and broken and afraid. Lord Thornwood, Darius said, you are charged with conspiracy, treason, and facilitating an attack on the crown. You opened the gates to our enemies and put the lives of everyone in this palace at risk, including the life of your own daughter. His silver eyes hardened. What do you have to say? Her father's gaze darted to Briar, and for a moment she saw something flicker in his expression. Not love, not regret, just calculation, even now. I was desperate, he said, his voice cracking. We had lost everything. Briar could have helped us, could have shared her good fortune, but she refused. What choice did I have? You had the choice to accept responsibility for your own failures, Briar said, stepping forward. You had the choice to be a father instead of a parasite. You chose neither. The hall fell silent, every eye fixed on her, waiting. The sentence is exile, Briar continued, her voice steady. You will be stripped of your title and your lands. You will be escorted to the southern border and released with nothing but the clothes on your back. If you ever return to the northern realm, you will be executed on sight. Her father stared at her, shock and fury warring in his expression. You would spare me? I would spare myself the burden of your death. Briar met his gaze without flinching. You are not worth killing. You are not worth anything at all. And I want you to live with that truth, for whatever years remain to you. The guards dragged him away, and Briar felt something loosen in her chest. A weight she had carried for 18 years, finally lifting. When the hall had emptied of prisoners and the nobles had begun to murmur among themselves, Darius turned to face her. His silver eyes were soft with love and something deeper, something that made her heart race. You showed mercy, he said quietly, even after everything he did to you. He does not deserve my hatred. Briar reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw. He does not deserve anything from me at all. I would rather spend my energy on the people who matter. Darius caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. Then, to the audible gasps of the remaining nobles, he dropped to one knee before her. Briar Thornwood, he said, his voice ringing through the hall. You walked into my life carrying a fire you did not understand, and you have burned through every wall I ever built. You are my mate, my equal, the other half of my soul. I cannot imagine a single day without you by my side. He reached into his coat and withdrew a ring, a band of white gold set with a stone that glowed like moonlight captured in glass. Will you marry me? He asked. Will you be my queen, not because fate demanded it, but because you choose it? Because you choose me? Briar sank to her knees before him, tears streaming down her face. She cupped his scarred cheek in her hand and smiled through her tears. I choose you, she whispered. I will always choose you. Darius slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, and the hall erupted into thunderous applause. She had been called a curse her entire life. Now she was a blessing, and she finally believed it. 1 year later, Briar stood in the palace nursery and watched the sunrise paint the mountains gold. The room had been her idea. She had chosen every piece of furniture herself, from the carved wooden cradle draped in soft furs to the rocking chair by the window where she now sat. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting wolves running beneath silver moons, and fresh flowers filled vases on every surface, their sweet scent mingling with the crisp mountain air. In her arms, wrapped in blankets of the softest white wool, her daughter slept. She was perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, a wisp of dark hair like her father's, and eyes that Briar already knew would be silver when they opened. She had been born 3 days ago, sliding into the world with a cry that had echoed through the palace halls and brought tears to every eye that heard it. The healers had worried at first. They had not known what the moonfire would do during childbirth, whether it would flare and harm those trying to help. But the fire had stayed quiet, banked to gentle embers, as if it knew that every hand reaching for Briar in those long hours meant only love. Seraphine had been there, holding Briar's hand through the worst of the pain. Darius had been there too, pale-faced and terrified, threatening to execute anyone who let harm come to his wife or child. When the baby finally arrived, healthy and whole, he had wept without shame and kissed Briar's sweaty forehead over and over until she laughed and pushed him away. Now he appeared in the doorway, his silver eyes soft with exhaustion and wonder. He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, one hand reaching out to brush his daughter's cheek with a gentleness that still surprised her. "She is so small," he murmured. "How can something so small have already stolen my entire heart?" Briar smiled. "She is your daughter. Stealing hearts is probably in her blood." Darius laughed quietly, careful not to wake the sleeping infant. He leaned up to press a kiss to Briar's lips, lingering there for a moment before pulling back to look at her. "Do you remember what you said to me the night we met?" he asked. "You told me not to stand so close, that you were not safe to be near." Briar's throat tightened. She remembered. She remembered the fear that had ruled her entire life, the certainty that her touch would only bring pain to anyone foolish enough to reach for her. "I remember," she whispered. Darius took her free hand and pressed it to his cheek, leaning into her palm the way he always did. "You were wrong," he said simply. "You have always been the safest place I have ever known." Tears slipped down Briar's cheeks, but they were happy tears, the only kind she seemed to cry these days. She looked down at her daughter, at the tiny life she and Darius had created together, and felt the moonfire stir gently in her chest. Not a curse, not a weapon, just a part of her, warm and bright and full of love. Her parents had called her cursed. They had locked her away and taught her to fear her own skin. They had tried to break her in ways she was still learning to heal from, but they had failed, because Briar was not cursed. She had never been cursed. She had simply been waiting for the right people to show her what she truly was. Loved, powerful, whole, and finally, blessedly, home.